Now I want to talk about the more recent modifications of the structuralist view, and I don't want to get into the details of this in great depth on this, but there are just some interesting aspects to this that sometimes I might make reference to, I might refer to, because as I mentioned, there are serious flaws, problems with the Marxist theories, but there can be sometimes, at least when it might be a nice shorthand reference to say, as the more recent modifications of the structuralist view might say, right? So I think what's interesting is what has happened is that in the 1960s and onward, there have been attempts, real serious attempts, to try to take the Marxist ideas, the structuralist ideas, and to apply them not just to one capitalist country, but to the global economy as a whole, right? So the idea is to think of, instead of you having a bourgeoisie within one capitalist country exploiting the proletariat, the working class people, the more recent structuralists think of it as in terms of a set of rich capitalist countries exploiting poor capitalist countries and controlling the global economy to promote their own economic interests. And then not only do they control the global economy, but they control the major institutions of the global economy, such as the IMF, World Bank, WTO. So let's look at just briefly some of these versions of the structuralist view. So one version that emerged in the 1960s was called dependency theory. There were some early versions of this that said, basically the rich capitalist countries, what one author, at least Andre Gunnar Frank, called the metropole countries. And by the way, the names of these authors don't really matter. I'm just trying to give you these ideas. But the early version of it was what I like to call the exploitation version, because it just said the rich capitalist countries, which sometimes were called the metropole countries. I don't know why. But the rich capitalist countries will exploit the poor capitalist countries, the satellite countries, and they will invest, their companies from the United States, for example, might go to Latin American countries and invest there and make profits and just send those profits back home and just to suck out all the resources and the profits from these countries, leaving the countries poorer than before. In fact, there'll be the development of underdevelopment. The countries will become poorer and poorer the more contact they have with rich capitalist countries. And the rich capitalist countries will just get richer and richer. So that was one. I call that the exploitation version of this. But there's a more recent version or a later version of this that developed. And in fact, I think it's ironic that it was developed when he was a young Marxist sociology professor at the University of Sao Paulo by this guy, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who, as you can see, he's wearing there the presidential sash. He later went on to become president of Brazil. He abandoned his Marxist ideas and said, now I embrace capitalism. So it maybe says something how the world in general has rejected a lot of these traditional Marxist ideas. But Cardoso had a different idea of dependency theory and how it worked, and others have developed it further. And so what he said was, look, yes, it's true. There are these rich capitalist countries exploiting the poor capitalist countries. But he said what happens is sometimes there are some segments of the poor capitalist country that benefit from the interaction. There's associated development that occurs, but it's dependent development. So in other words, if you have big transnational corporations going to Brazil and investing there, maybe some rich local counterparts or their joint venture partners in Sao Paulo will also become wealthy and will also benefit from this association with the transnational enterprises. But the country as a whole will be hurt and will remain poor and will always remain dependent on the technology and the capital that comes from the advanced capitalist countries and will never really prosper on its own. And the only solution is to adopt socialism. And so that was the original thinking of someone like Fernando Henrique Cardoso. But later, of course, as I mentioned, he himself abandoned these ideas, and it's others that have taken them forward. So the idea is that just, as I mentioned, just a small segment of the satellite poor countries would benefit. So, and then still another version of this is the idea that you have these rich capitalist countries that this author at least called the core countries. These are the advanced capitalist countries. We used to call them the group of 7 most advanced industrialized countries. They really control the global economy. They control the institutions of the global economy. They are the ones that determine what happens. But the poorest countries, maybe African countries, Haiti. These countries are completely exploited by these. They have no power of their own. But there's a middle group. And these could be called the semi-periphery. They're in between the very poorest, the periphery, and the core countries. And they serve as kind of a buffer between the core and the periphery. You could think of this as South Korea or Brazil. So countries will only join the core if the core countries allow them to move up from one category to another. So this is the idea that the rich capitalist countries control the global economy for their own benefit, are exploiting these other countries. And so sometimes in the course I may make reference, the core countries, the rich advanced capitalist countries, sometimes they do have undue influence on what happens in the International Monetary Fund or the WTO, and we'll talk about that. But that's why there is some validity at times, as we'll see, to some of these ideas, even if the underlying Marxist theories are completely, debunked, right? So that's what I wanted to say about that. And now we'll move on to the comparison of all of these theories.